Hello, my name is Felipe Prado, and I'm here to introduce a proposed study in development of intergroup cognition, more specifically, the foundations of social group preferences. My study builds on the relevant knowledge from the Week 4 module. During this week, we read three research papers. Number one, by Kinsler, Dubois, Spelk, 2007, investigated the relationship between native language and social preference through the use of a forced choice paradigm. The research showed preverbal infants are more likely to look at and receive toys from speakers of their own language. The study also showed that children are more likely to desire being a friend of native speakers of their own language than a foreign speaker. The study suggests that there is a tendency to favor unknown individuals of one's own social group since preverbal infancy and experience has an important role in development, given that a children's first language is learned through experience. Number two was done by Chao, Quinn, Liu, Li, Pascalis, and Ji in 2016, and it aimed to investigate whether Chinese infants of different ages that lived in China would associate own race face and other race face with happy or sad music. The findings support the notion that asymmetric exposure to Chinese faces could have led Chinese children to associate own race faces with happy music and other race faces with sad music by 9 months of age, but not by 3 or 6 months of age. The findings suggest that implicit racial bias emerges around the first year of life, which is dependent on the environment, that is, the asymmetrical exposure to Chinese faces, and the native language, which is Chinese. Number 3 was a research done by Pon, Ferreira, Dijsendruck, Hamlin, and Barron in 2015, and it looked to independently measure positivity and negativity towards the outgroup in infancy. The research successfully showed that preverbal infants expect in-group members to be pro-social, but don't expect out-group members to be antisocial, allowing for the notion that these two mechanisms are not naturally co-occurring. A further longitudinal study of the specific mechanisms underlying each aspect of infant social group preferences is necessary to explain why such phenomena becomes apparent in a different time. Taken together, the findings and implications suggested by the previously mentioned literature can lead one to wonder whether asymmetric exposure to own race stimuli is related to social group preferences in infancy, given that these studies support the knowledge that cultural experiences have strong influences in the social preferences infants have, and may be a determinant feature of this type of social development. I looked at 3 developmental studies that looked specifically at the effects of the cultural environment, more specifically, the asymmetric exposure to one race on the development of social preferences. One of these studies was by Shao, Fu, Quinn, Tanaka, Pascalis, and Li, where they conducted the test whether perceptual individuation training with other race faces could reduce children's implicit social bias. Under an angry equals outgroup paradigm with the pre-test and post-test, Shao et al. Demonstrated that individuation training with Chinese 4 and 5-year-olds children proved efficiently in reducing implicit racial bias when using African faces, but not with Chinese faces. The findings indicate that the racial bias emerges in early childhood and is consistent with age. Additionally, and more importantly, the researchers demonstrated that this mechanism is malleable in early childhood. An important implication is the connection of perceptual and social information in neural representations, with prior to training leads children to disassociate their race from others, and after training leads to a neural representation that is more solid. Therefore, the training serves the purpose of familiarizing children with other races, leading to a more symmetric exposure and hence a decrease in implicit racial bias. Hence, the study establishes a correlational relationship between exposure and social preferences, as well as a correlational relationship between individuation training, and social implicit bias. Number 2 was a research by Shao, Quinn, Zhe, Thummeltz-Schammer, Wu, Liu, Kirkham, Pascalis, and Li. I looked to investigate whether infants perceived a known race member as a more reliable source of information through the use of eye-gaze-cue. By measuring the infant's responsiveness to members that were extremely moderately and unreliable, the researchers were able to associate a greater perception when the information was presented by an own race member, possibly due to a greater exposure, and hence greater positive experience with sad population group. The researchers argue that an asymmetric exposure to own race members led to the generalization of the other groups, which, given that the experience should be mainly positive with other own race members, despite their view that they are more individual, led infants to judge them as 100% reliable when they were 50% reliable, whereas non-members were judged as if they were 25% reliable when in fact they were 50%. This finding is consistent with previously mentioned research such as Shao et al., since their method of individuation training showed how the repetitive action of categorizing ethnic groups with children haven't had that much contact with leads to decreased racial bias, creating a reason to believe that the schematization of other races is not as promptly available as our own due to cultural experience. Denham, Chen, and Banerjee investigated the relationship contribution of in-group preferences and status-based enculturation across two different cultures, the Taiwanese and American. 3 different ethnic groups, black, white, and Asian, and ranging from age of 4 to 14, the study made use of angry equals out-group paradigm to test different populations and their social preferences. The investigation rewarded 3 important findings. First, the in-group preference and status-based enculturation are early emerging. Secondly, these mechanisms do not show any age-related changes. Thirdly, in-group preference is not always present in infancy, as their experiments with African Americans revealed that they have less preference for their own race than white Americans. Hence, the investigation was extremely relevant towards an understanding of the foundations and origins of an early emerging in-group racial bias, because it showed that studies focused on a specific population group, such as described by another study regarding the population study in social sciences. The study was done by Noren Zion, and it's at the reference section. It talks about a weird population, which is the population that we look at mostly in psychological studies. And it can lead us to make erroneous assumptions about human development. It may well be the case that we are generalizing findings of social racial bias from one category, such as whites, rich, westernized Americans, for instance, to the rest of the world, making the development of more cosmopolitan research necessary, since this is not the first research to show less in-group social bias in races that differ from white Americans, suggesting that cultural experience and race can have important implications for the development and foundations of social preferences. I have also chosen an additional study to aid the understanding of the effect of cultural environment on implicit social bias. Tedmore, Chow, Wiru, Chim, Pawan, Hong, and Wang investigating the underlying role of epistemic freezing, the process by which the creative reasoning that allows for rationalization and formation of novel hypotheses ceases functioning. The researchers investigate the role of such maturation mechanism in the reduced stereotype endorsement, symbolic racism, and discriminatory hiring decisions associated with multicultural experiences. The study is the first to test the underlying effect of lower need for cognitive closure in adults who have gone through multicultural experiences, which explain the ameliorative effects on cognitively infused dimensions of intergroup bias. Despite not being a developmental study, I believe adding this unique study to the body of research is quite useful due to its further support for the effect cultural experiences have on foundations and development of social preferences. I have also chosen it because it is the only research that connects social preference with motivation. The perceptual social linkage hypothesis suggests that greater perceptual exposure to own race faces accompanied mostly by positive experiences leads to implicit racial bias, favoring one's own race and against other races. If supported by enough evidence, this knowledge could prove to be imperative for the understanding of the foundations of human social cognition, given that an inborn proclivity towards members of the same race could help us better shape the education system in the future in order to make children more cooperative and less socially biased. This finding could also help the debates of nature versus nurture, as this social preference has long been a cause for debate, since there isn't enough evidence to support the claim that these social preferences are inborn, neither enough information to argue it is a consequence of the environment. Therefore, my research question was, to what extent is exposure to a social group associated with in-group bias a predictor of future racial preference for in-group? The overwhelming amount of literature regarding the foundations and development of social preferences makes recurrent reference to the distinction between attitudes towards the in-group and out-group by looking through different explicit and implicit methods. Therefore, there is an array of evidence regarding such differences in perception. However, not much has been done to address the environmental factors that influence such perception differences. Regardless of the knowledge that asymmetrical exposure has been known to be a correlational factor of in-group racial bias. Henceforth, the current research question aims to further investigate the relationship of cultural background, environment as a whole, and the implicit attitudes and perceptions towards the in-group and the out-group. My hypothesis is that if this study were to be conducted, I would expect cultures that have low amounts of genetic variation and higher negative attitudes towards certain race groups to have particularly strengthened implicit racial bias, that they are less malleable and predictors of future racial preference for the in-group. To measure this, I propose a long developmental study much like the Harvard study of adult development, in which inhabitants of two different countries such as Sudan and Brazil are tested for implicit intergroup bias every month of the infancy and year of childhood. During adulthood, measurements can be a bit more far apart. But stereotype endorsement, symbolic racism, and discriminatory hiring decisions will be measured. The aim of picking infants from these countries offers a prominent insight, since Sudan is a country in which strong negative attitudes towards a certain group are particularly salient, which actually led to a civil war, splitting the country in half, which makes possible that a negative balance is observable from an earlier age, not only childhood, maybe in infancy. Brazil was picked for its extremely diverse genetic pool, which may influence social preferences more positively than white American students. The population study will be pre-verbal infants at the start of the study because it's longitudinal, so they will eventually become adults, which will be random sample. Instead of using forced choice paradigm like Kinsler, I propose that the study should use a habituation paradigm to measure expectancy of pro-social and antisocial behavior independently, like Barron et al. Conducted in 2015. The only difference between the previously mentioned study of Barron and the current study is that the population would have a different cultural setting, and that the study would be a longitudinal and the measurement of racial bias later in life, which is not measured by the expected results. Given that Boone et al. 2015 demonstrated pre-verbal infants expected own race members to behave more pro-socially, but don't expect other race members to act antisocially, and Xiao et al. 2017 demonstrated that children, despite contradicting personal experiences, trusted own race members' eye gaze cue much more than other race members. I expect pre-verbal Sudanese infants to have a higher expectancy for pro-social behavior from own race members and an early emergence tendency to expect other race members to be antisocial. I expect this difference to be more pronounced during childhood, when Brazilian children should already have some tendency to expect antisocial behavior by other race members. Given that Xiao et al. 2015 found children's social preferences to be malleable to individuation training, I expect Brazilian children to be relatively less consistent with the bias, given that they higher exposure to other race members than Sudanese infants. Given the lack of literature with longitudinal studies, I don't have any specific expectations about the extent to which early cultural experience will be a determinant or associated with stereotype endorsement, symbolic racism, and discriminatory hiring decisions. But taking Tadmore et al. Into account, results would probably predict that one would expect the group with relatively higher multicultural experiences, the Brazilians, to be less associated with racial bias measurements in adulthood. The implications of the study. If the predicted results were true, there would be an established negative causal relationship between asymmetric exposure to race, that is, an experience of lower cultural diversity, and implicit racial bias, which would be determinant of racial attitudes later in life. The findings could be extremely significant for developmental psychology because they would support the perceptual social linkage hypothesis and thus make future research more interested in the environmental factors that shape our social preferences. On a more global scale and more practical instead of theoretical, we would add the ironically lacking multicultural studies to the base of contemporary curriculum. I say it is ironic because we live in the most globalized society that has ever existed. However, one of the world's most powerful countries, the United States, and many others do not pose nearly enough importance on a matter that could change how Americans and others are seen, and more importantly, how they see the world. Such change in education could be a determining factor towards a more globalized world where we'll be able to see a better communication and synthesization of other cultures. Thank you.